Good afternoon, everyone. It is 2 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and jump in. So excited to be with you all here today with people from all across the US, and I did notice a few people internationally as well. So excited to have this opportunity to collaborate, share this time with you. We will have opportunity. Feel free to drop chats, Q&A, questions. I'll do my best to keep track of this as host, keep track of the chats. Um, but all the panelists, feel free to jump in and say, hey, we got somebody on chat that you need to answer a question, kind of keep me honest. So hopefully we'll be able to answer your questions as we move along. But as I said, we will have time at the end to have some Q&A. So excited to be with you guys here today. I am the host for the panel today. I'm Dr. Taylor Tribble, president and founder of EduSkills. So for the agenda, we just kind of lay out for kind of logistics. We will have an introduction, so for the panelists to be able to introduce them to you guys in the event that you don't know who they are, but chances are you know many of them, if not all of them. But they'll get a second just to introduce who they are, why they're passionate about supporting newcomers. I am excited also with this panel, and including myself, all of us are former educators of newcomer students, so we do have experience in the classroom and continue to work with teachers on a day-to-day basis. So hopefully you find that our background and expertise lends to some unique insights and things that you might be able to consider utilizing in your school district and in the role that you guys are in currently. So we'll have a discussion with the panelists for approximately 40 minutes, a Q&A session, and then closing remarks. We are scheduled to end at 3 Central, 4 Eastern. Hopefully this we'll have enough time to cover everything. Obviously, if we go over, you got things to do, feel free to jump off. We are recording this as well, and we'll share it out at a later date. So with that, just want to give you a brief intro to EduSkills if you're not familiar to what we do. As I had mentioned, I am a former educator and founder of EduSkills. We've served school districts across the nation for over 10 years now, and our focus on utilizing technology to support unique needs of multilingual students, provide a student database where you're able to go in and find information and relevant reports that are required by state and federal governments, as well as unique instructional support for students. So if you're not familiar with our work, I encourage you to look at our website at eduskillsllc.com and feel free to reach out if you would like to learn more. With that, we'll jump right in with introductions. I am fortunate to know all of the panelists. Well, I guess, Lara, you and I have been recently introduced, but the rest on the panel have known for 5 to 10 years, some more. So very good friends. And again, I thank all you panelists for being part of the discussion today. With my background and knowledge of you, I know that you are very passionate about supporting newcomers and multilingual students in schools and have a really unique background and insight into what schools might be able to do to better support their newcomers. So if you guys don't mind, I don't think I can do total justice to introduction. If you guys could just go around, starting with Louise, and just give a brief background and kind of what insights you bring to the table regarding supporting newcomers.
Thank you so much, Taylor, and for EduSkills for hosting. It's an honor and a treat to be here and share space with everyone today. My name is Louise El Yaafouri. I am indeed a former newcomer educator with 12 years in the classroom, and we still work hand in hand with educators now. I'm the founder of Diversified Consulting. Our background in Diversified is in education. However, we also work with a number of other resettlement sorts of entities, departments of public health and environment, state departments, departments of health and human services, to ensure integration services for newcomers and new Americans as a whole. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to learn from everyone else on the panel. And Lara, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Louise. Yes, and thanks, Taylor. Really excited to be here. My name is Lara Evangelista. I'm the Executive Director of Internationals Network for Public Schools. We're an education nonprofit that partners with schools and districts to support them to design schools and programs and develop educator capacity to better serve their newcomer students. As an organization, we've been around 20 years. Our first school opened 40 years ago, and we have about 31 schools and academies across the country, as well as a number of many other partners. Before I became an executive director, I spent almost 30 years in New York City public schools as a teacher, school leader, and then district leader within the Internationals Network, within those schools. So my heart is with newcomer students. It's what I have done since I first stepped into the classroom, and I'm really passionate about this as a child of immigrants myself, and really excited to be here today and share a little bit about what I know. And I will pass it on to Dr. Forbes.
Before you do feel free, Louise, Lara, and Dr. Forbes, Dr. Vianna, to drop links to information about you. If the attendees would like to learn more about your work, feel free to drop that in the chat.
Well, thank you so much to you, Dr. Chibble, for having us here. Thank you very much to EduSkills for sponsoring this webinar today. It is truly an honor to be with such a distinguished panel, and I feel very humbled and thankful to be able just to be in this space and part of this conversation. For those of you who know me, you already know this. For those of you who don't, I wanted to be a dancing bilingual veterinarian before I ever got into the field of education. And I was so thankful in my very first educational position to be a newcomer teacher in a class that was 6th through 8th grade, representing 11 countries and 9 different languages. And ever since then, my passion has just grown so much, considering the role of cultural proficiency and what that plays in education today. And so I'm thankful to be able to be supporting schools and school districts in any aspect, but most specifically focused on multilingual and multicultural education, and also adjuncting at the University of Central Oklahoma, which has been so incredibly fun. And I am just very, very thankful again to be with all of you. And I hope that you all have a wonderful time.
Thank you, Kelly. Dr. Forbes, Dr. Vianna, last but not least.
That's right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to add my welcome and an honor to be here with this panel and with all of you. Thank you all for your dedication to helping our students, especially our newcomers, succeed. I have a passion for newcomers because, like so many proud immigrants through the years, I came to this country with my mom from Cuba in search for a better life and for the freedom and justice that we were denied in Cuba. My dad actually was a political prisoner, so he stayed behind in Cuba. I just have to say I'm always moved by the courage and the spirit that our immigrant and refugee families show when they move to this country. So newcomers are definitely a passion for me. When I walked into my kindergarten classroom, I did not know a word of English because Spanish was what we spoke at home. And it would have been very confusing, even frightening if it hadn't been for my teacher back then, Mrs. Larkin, and her miracles. I'm a seasoned educator. I really don't know how she taught me to learn to speak in English and to read and all of that. But I have to tell you, when my dad joined us finally from Cuba, it was the end of my kindergarten year, and I had to teach him English in order for him to get a job. And that's where I fell in love with teaching. I became an ESOL teacher for many years in Miami, Florida, then became a school administrator for a diverse elementary school in Durham, North Carolina. Eventually ran the migrant education program for North Carolina. And before joining Lexia, which is a language and literacy educational technology company, I had the honor of being the assistant deputy secretary at the Office of English Language Acquisition for the U.S. Department of Education. So you can see it's a big passion for me since I was little, and really truly excited to have this conversation with all of you today.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. And I would also invite you. 3 of the 4 panelists have been on the Cultural Connections Cultural Connections Lab podcast, which EduSkills also sponsors. Would invite you guys to listen to interviews with Louise, Dr. Forbes, Dr. Vianna, and Lara. You've got to be next on the list, so they can hear your story and background as well. So beyond supporting newcomer students, that you can learn a lot more about their background, experience, and recommendations for supporting school districts. So I'd invite you to do that. So thank you for those introductions. So from there, we will move on. I'm going to stop sharing unless you guys just want us to keep seeing those slides. Move on to the questions for the panelists. So starting off, just from a general standpoint, you guys can answer this as you like, choose to, as the panelists choose to like, in order you choose to like, or that you choose. What are some of the common challenges that you guys have seen, and many on the panel, that are attendees in this session see, and what are some of the components that you have seen that are maybe unique to providing better support that some of the on the call could consider to providing support to school districts across the U.S.? Don't be too shy now.
I can start. I'll just say that our students are they bring so many gifts, they bring so many assets, right, to our classrooms, and but they are new to a city, to a country, and there are so many things that they and their families are navigating, and I would say that school is one piece of the many things that they are adjusting to, right? And so we have to remember as educators that a lot of times they're looking for housing, they're looking for healthcare, they're looking for jobs, they're looking sometimes for a place where they can have community, religious kind of connections, and there's so many things that they are juggling. And I should mention that our schools focus specifically on adolescent students, and so as adolescents, a lot of times they're put in these more adult roles, right, where they are supporting their families to make those connections, right, to help them with the rent, to help them with that. And so there are just a lot of outside responsibilities that a lot of times students are juggling. And I think as schools, we need to keep those things in mind and think about what kind of supports can we build into our schools to both create stability for students and support them with that, because we're in a really powerful position as a school, because we're usually the first point of contact for families. And so if we build a really key relationship with families and our students, we can provide some supports in some of those outside areas.
Thank you, Laura. I might piggyback on that on 2 points. One of the unique things about our role and situation is that we get to be in schools and districts and classrooms all across the US and abroad. So we get to see what's going on and what's working across the country. And I will say there is a much more concentrated focus on that community piece. We're seeing a lot more schools gravitate toward a community school model and have that as the basis for the entire structure of the school. That it truly is a very community oriented, give and take. Parents are embedded, parents are empowered, family members, community members, shop owners in the neighborhood. It's all part of healthcare providers. It's all part of one model, and everyone has a voice, everyone has a say. And so in the design or redesign of schools, we're seeing much more concentrated focus into the community school model, which I think is really exciting. We're in a really cool place with this right now. And with that, I would say, while a lot of us as schools, we've had connections, there's more focus on community asset mapping, on drawing out some really powerful maps and creating links. So if you haven't done community asset mapping for your school or organization, that would be one interesting place to start. Another piece, you mentioned the adolescents, and I would say something that we are experiencing is traditionally, my background is in newcomer specific, meaning ORR eligible, coming through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Over the last few years, that's shifted so much because we now have humanitarian parolees, which we haven't seen in a really long time. We have TPS. We have a lot of different sorts of documentation status pieces. And while we can't ask about that in the schools, it's important to note because each of those has different sorts of supports embedded. So our traditional refugee resettlement students have lots of supports. They have a resettlement partnership. They have someone to help them enroll in school, and they have more housing and financial support at the beginning. They have job training and employment. Those families who are humanitarian parolees, which happen to include a lot of our off-ground families, for example, don't have that same robust system of support. It's a very condensed timeline of support. The caseworkers might not be available to follow that family further out. So we're seeing higher rates of attrition for our males in particular of high school age, because the most important thing is to be working. And this is also true for our students who do not yet have documented status. TPS, of course, comes with no supports. And if you are an asylum seeker hoping to apply for TPS, that also comes with those supports or protection. So working to understand, as you said, students have so many other things going on in their families. So if we can catch the bigger picture, we have a better chance of keeping students with us in schools for longer, which is great for education, but also for their socio-emotional development and economic opportunities in the future as well.
I love that. Those are excellent points. I always like to bring up something that my colleagues just shared, but really emphasize a couple of things on it. So we know that some newcomer students and their families, they may be proficient in English. They may already have some experience with school structures that are similar to the U.S. public schools, but many of them, they don't just need like language accommodations, but they need orientation to these processes, procedures, family engagement opportunities, things like that you find in our U.S. schools. Even for native English speakers, it can be a struggle. So attending schools in the United States is very unique. And can be very challenging, right? So one of the things that when I was at the federal level, one of the things that I liked assisting our newcomers with were the certain rights that were available to students and family members of school-age children, right? Starting with how national origin, citizenship, immigration status does not change these rights. So making a point for them to understand that, yes, they're new to the country, but there's rights that are available to them no matter what their status is, right? All school-age children, regardless of their citizenship or immigration status, may have access to free public school education in the school district where they live. And schools cannot be asking for documentation that would prohibit or discourage a child from enrolling or attending in schools. That's why what Louise was talking about, a lot of times we have these centers or groups that help with this enrolling process, because you've got these assistants that are there, behind the desk with a checklist of things that they're expecting from these families, and they may not be aware of the federal rights that our families have, right? Schools must identify students who need services to learn English and provide information about their language proficiency level, the programs and services that are available to meet the students' education needs, including the parents' right to opt out of a program or a service for English learners. So there's a lot of rights, right? Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act says that school districts must provide the required communications to parents of English learners under Title I. And it needs to be in an understandable format, right? And when possible, in a language that the parents understand. I've been to many districts where they see it as an extra, right? Like, oh, it'd be nice if we can provide. No, by law, they have to provide the opportunity for parents to engage in an understandable format. So they need to provide those language services, right? And of course, a safe and supportive setting without bullying and harassment, things like that. So there's all these alienable rights that all students have available to them, and we have to make it clear to our families, especially our newcomer families, because they might not be aware.
I mean, this information is so amazing, and I'm so excited for everyone who's participating to get to hear all of this. I come at this as not having ever been through the newcomer experience myself, but in my educational experience, my very first position was working with the newcomer students, and then all the way up to director of dual language education and trying to, focus on what has already been mentioned. But I really want to come back to the idea that Laura was talking about of assets. And I just think it's so important for us to remember that these souls that come into our communities, we are so fortunate. This is not one more thing. We are so fortunate to be able to get to expand our point of views and our own perceived realities, like through that constructivist lens, to be able to consider all of the amazing assets that are brought into the classroom, the language, the culture, the different ways to do mathematics. I mean, just how Spanish, for example, has elevated my English. Being able to get through that lens of meta-linguistic awareness in the way that has changed my entire life and has broadened my horizons and enhanced my friendships and helped me understand through those relationships what culture means to different people. And you can't separate language and culture. And I just think it's so enriching. And so, one, to focus on those assets, embrace them, lean into them in any way that you can, and ask students and families through your engagement processes to share what those assets are, because we see things as we are, not as they typically are. And so we have to really change our mindset. And with all of that, I think that we can eliminate fear that teachers often have. Fear in the aspect of, I don't know how to best teach this child sometimes. Fear from the principals or the superintendent's point of view. I don't know how to enact certain policies to help these communities and families. Again, lean into the assets, but my biggest takeaway is create spaces where we can seek to understand. But whenever we do that we actually practice what we preach. We use our 2 ears and close our one mouth and we listen. Because then I feel like we're really able to engage our stakeholders, our students, our families in such a way that we can have those opportunities for ironing to sharpen iron, bring ourselves together, create this space of belonging, and really just allow ourselves to rethink and reconsider how much better we can be whenever we build upon the assets of all of us.
Thank you all. It absolutely is an honor and a privilege to serve multilingual students and communities, and so excited to be on a call with those that are like-minded. A common theme that seems to be coming up today and recently, even Dr. Forbes and I were on our podcast yesterday, and a lot of things coming up around family and how to engage families and stories about how beneficial it is for school districts to think of unique ways to engage families. So can you guys kind of maybe dig a little bit deeper on what role family engagement plays in the success of newcomer students, and maybe give specific examples of where do schools start if they don't have a robust family engagement program? What kind of things can they do that lead to academic, sociolinguistic growth, and even just kind of personal, emotional growth as well for newcomer students?
I can speak to this. Some of the work that we do is directly family facing. So we offer quite a few workshops in schools, and these are really schools that want to start this process, but one, aren't really sure where to begin. Two, there's funding, and the biggest one is time, right? That schools often have great ideas, staff and teachers have great ideas, but the time to implement that is challenging. So what we'll often do is come in as an outside source and run those workshops. So for example, at some of our elementary schools, we run a 6-week series and then repeat. And those offer classes on, as you mentioned, Dr. Vianna, about the rights. What rights do families have in and around schooling? How to use the school technology. We offer one on medical rights and medical access. You also have medical rights. You have medical access. You are, in the same way that you are folks are required to translate into a language of understanding in the school setting. They're need to do that in a medical setting as well. So we offer one on medical rights and medical access, and then one on employment and being able to work, whatever your documentation status is, because those are the things in the community listening sessions that came out as the most important. Back to Dr. Forbes, that you were talking about, the community listening sessions, I just can't say enough about. Not only are there massive funds of knowledge in a community, there are needs in a community. And while I think we are very well intended in the school setting, we are often also comprised of a relatively monochromatic, mono-experiential background and how we're viewing what we think will work for our families, what we think our families might need. But where's the family voice in that, right? We can ask what you tell us from your perspective and your lens, how can we better serve you? And once you have that knowledge, then you have your blueprint, then you have a map, then you can say, okay, we've done it before. We've taken workshops and put them out, but it's missed the mark. And why? Because we're missing voice in the first place, right? So if you can start there, then the rest of your programming will flow and will make an impact. We'll draw more folks in. Those folks will tell their folks, and then you'll start to see a community evolve around those workshops and have some repeat family members, caretakers who come for not just the workshops, but also to be part of a community and a place of belonging.
Engagement can mean so many different things. Like, my kids I have school age children, and and I hope this mom isn't like on this webinar. I don't think she is, but I get all these emails from her, like do this and we need you to do that and blah blah blah, whatever. So there's that type of engagement. It's very important to kind of break through that with our newcomers, right? Because bottom line is, when schools welcome newcomer families and collaborate with them in a way that respects their values and cultures and languages and assets and all of that, the entire community, the school, everyone's enriched by it, right? And what I've noticed is highly successful schools, they spend time with families during that enrollment process, right? When you first see them. I can't tell you how many times, I know it's happened to me, where I'm enrolling my child and it's like, here's your packet, see you later, right? They should take a tour. They should meet the teachers. Everyone should get to know each other. It's such an important part of the process. And that's engagement there. It's more than just going to the field trip or being in this event. I've noticed at these schools, what they do is they just regularly communicate with their families and visit with them, even in their homes, to address challenges and opportunities, because our newcomer families need specific information on how to support their children's learning needs. And that's where, again, the engagement definition can take various forms, because I think one of the things we have to do, it's a very important step for schools, is to address the barriers to this school and family partnership, right? The culture of U.S. schools and the expectations for family engagement may be new to a lot of our newcomer families. In their home country or wherever they're from, they may not have collaborated with schools as closely or actively as we see here in the United States, right? I know with my mom, she would drop me off and it was like, okay, he's all yours, right? But in the United States, we expect this family engagement, and it's expected to be explicit and school-based and visible to everyone, and we're volunteering and the parents are initiating contact with teachers. So those little things are things we need to unpack with our families so that they can better understand how they can engage and how their voice can be heard, right? I think one way that they can engage, that it's not like your typical, American way of engaging with schools, is encouraging them and teaching them to advocate for their children, not just at school, but at home, to support them and foster their achievement, positive behaviors, persistence, things like that, being actively participating in their learning and things like that. So it doesn't have to just be things that you do in the school, making sure that they're attending school every day, being ready to learn. And then you can push in some of those, how to communicate with the school about things and how to collaborate with educators and those types of things. So anyway, I think my bottom line is that engagement can take many forms, and it doesn't have to be what we typically think of as engagement. And we can help our parents understand that, and that they can still play a role in they can still be engaged in many different ways.
I would just add to that. I mean, you both said exactly what I was thinking of, like that initial contact with the family, so important. It's like your moment of like, is this family going to feel welcome and like you're there for them, or is this just like a bureaucratic experience? So like that is such a key moment. But also, a couple of other things just to build on what you both said. The partnerships are so important, the CBOs, all of the community school work. But I would say on a basic level, like multilingual communication, right? Like that has to be a priority, bottom line. Like that, it can't be an afterthought. It has to just be an expectation, is that, especially with technology now, we're able to do that much more easily than in the past when I was a teacher and a leader and so on. And so that has to be a bottom line. The second is investing in staff, right, who are multilingual. And that's a longer term kind of like pipeline work, but like that has to be a priority in our schools. Like our counselors, like we like are, as much as we can, all of our counselors and social workers are all bilingual, speaking the multiple languages of our families. And I would say the next thing is, we've been able to bring families in sometimes to be hired at the school in different capacities, because then they are a model for other families, right? To be like, and then the other thing I would say is be creative, similar to what you're saying about what engagement looks like. First of all, a lot of the families, they're working a lot of the time. And also we have to be careful of assumptions about like who they're actually living with. They may not be living with their families, right? I mean, we have a lot of unaccompanied youth. We have people who are, so we have young people who've been separated from their families and are just getting to know them again and are rebuilding that relationship. So they may not feel like they want their family connected. And so being really thoughtful about that. In our schools, one of the ways that we engage families is through our project-based instruction, right? And so like the projects will be a way to engage families. So it's like you're doing an oral history, or you're doing a history about, something in your country. Maybe you're going to go home and you're going to interview your family in order to like add that to your project. Or maybe you're going to WhatsApp them because they're still back in your country and you want to incorporate that. That's a way for families to be engaged in the work. When we do our performance assessments, we invite families to come in and and watch the students as they present. Sometimes the students are presenting in English and the families don't necessarily understand everything in English, but the student will translate for their family. And I can't tell you how proud family members are to see their young person doing that. I mean, families, cry. They are so excited to be there. Maybe they're not there every single day volunteering in the library, going on the trips, but there are other ways to bring them in and start connecting them to the community and who you are as a school.
I'm going to share a link real quickly, and it's not all pertaining to this topic, but it's a link to a Google Doc that has some legal links to it, and I wanted to share it because we're having this conversation about the importance of interpretation and translation, and so of course, like I said, there's other links on there too, but that is so important. And I mean, all of this is so important. I'm just so thankful to get to be with all of you and hearing this myself from such amazing experts. But I think one of the questions that we have to really stop and ask ourselves is that we, like Louise, you were saying about, we project this idea of engagement, right? But how often are we asking how people and families want to be engaged, how communities want to be engaged, but then really asking the question, how am I engaging? How am I going into the community that I am serving? And recently, it was so much fun to be able to have a conversation with some educators, and we were talking about some pedagogical practices and ways to incorporate culture in our lessons, et cetera. Through that conversation, though, became the bigger conversation of asking the question, how often do you engage in the communities of the students that you serve? Whether it be, I go to that store and shop instead, or I might go buy groceries over here instead, or I'm gonna go eat at a restaurant over here instead, and really try to be more engaged and involved, at least that surface level. There's so many more deeper levels that you can get to, but just to get into the other community. And I was saying that because I have friends, my partner as well. Sometimes for example, we were on a trip and we went to, it was an international supermarket. And I was just loving it because there was different languages and different food. I mean, it was all international, so many different people in this one area. And I looked and he's like, oh my gosh, it's just so overwhelming. And I thought, like for me, I'm seeing this from a very different lens, but like that's an experience that's building empathy a little bit to understand, like, yeah, being a newcomer, coming into a new culture, a new area, it's very overwhelming. It has to be incredibly overwhelming. But whenever we consider how we become more engaged, I think going through that process allows us to have more insights to be able to, in addition to of having those sessions where we're actually asking how families and communities want to be engaged, it really allows us to change our practices and hopefully our mindsets. And I think that's whenever we can get to a part to not only institutionalize cultural knowledge, but to really value it as an asset, again, to what we're doing overall in the community. And then just like the last wrap up of that is, I think that we need to be doing this through the lens of collective impact also. So many of us come and go in our positions, but these schools and these districts belong to the students that live there, and we are just fortunate to be able to serve in those spaces while we try to maintain law and legalities and regulations. But at the same time, this qualitative component of this is not necessarily our school, this is the community school. So whenever I have a position and I come and go, who is that leader? What's that leader organization? What's that leader in that area that is always going to be there before me, during me, and after me to continue this work? And how are we engaging in each other for that work to always continue and not just be systemic whenever I leave, it doesn't work anymore, for example.
Thank you all for those insights. I've also enjoyed being part of these conversations recently. Again, I feel like a common thing coming up has been family engagement. Specifically, Dr. Forbes, you and I on a call with Dr. Joby Lawrence yesterday, talking about specific examples where she, as an educator, a former educator, and have seen other school districts do home visits. So I know that that's not always possible, but trying to think about things outside the box as specific examples of, especially for newcomer students, if it is an option to be able to visit their home, like how valuable of an opportunity and experience that is for everyone involved, including the educator, and how impactful that is on the students' language acquisition and academic growth opportunity. When they feel that somebody really cares about them, they are much more likely to be engaged in the classroom, in the school community. So thank you guys again for those insights, and do encourage everyone out there to kind of think about those opportunities outside the box that we don't think about every day when it comes to how to support academic and linguistic and language acquisition for our newcomer students. Dr. Vianna, I know you have quite a unique perspective on and experience when it comes to educating students. As former educator, you've worked at the state level, you've worked at the national level, you've worked for private companies. So with all of those things in mind, what advice might you give to our listeners, school leaders, and educators, specifically to help improve services, and how they might connect those dots between, the support and service they might be able to get from the national level, from, U.S. Department of Education, types of things they think about, what they might need to think about for private companies providing support, and then state level support as well. So if you could just kind of give some insights into trying to put all those pieces of the puzzle together, how can educators kind of maybe learn from your experience to better support newcomer students?
Yes, definitely. I will drop in the chat. There's the Newcomer Toolkit. It's a free resource that you get from OELA, my former office, the Office of English Language Acquisition. And I ask you all to check it out. It's got everything you need, from developing a welcoming environment to the rights that our families have, things like that are all covered there. And you'd find specific recommended components to provide a high quality education for your newcomers. Some of the things that I remember from in there is the need to develop a set of common values about newcomers and accept shared accountability for their education across all the departments within a district, right? They should adopt almost like a unified language development framework for our students, especially when you think of, high school students and newcomers that come in a little later, right? We need to integrate so much content, analytic practices, academic literacy, and obviously language learning. Everything needs to happen simultaneously to accelerate their language journey. So developing a strong framework is important. Districts need to promote the use and development of newcomers' home languages. We've been talking about that asset-based and focusing on what they bring to our classrooms, but it's more than just in being inclusive, but making it systematic, right? One of the things that I noticed in my visits throughout the nation is not many districts had protocols or schools had protocols to ensure that newcomers have access to all the course offerings, to all the educational services, even gifted and talented, things that are available, and they didn't have access because they were so laser focused on language acquisition, right? Even thinking ahead, like processes for transition into mainstream programs or even post-secondary. Sometimes we focus a little too much on the language piece. One thing that I always, and it's a hot topic right now, but we've brought it up a couple of times, is the importance of recruiting, placing, and retaining qualified teachers, and providing that ongoing professional learning. That's key for our school districts. And then there's something that EduSkills is perfect and excels at, right? And it's critical, especially for our newcomers who tend to be almost invisible in our schools because there's no data for a couple of years, right? And that's the importance for schools and districts to collect and analyze student and program data to drive continuous improvement and instruction and those kinds of things. So, again, our newcomers are sometimes invisible when it comes to data, so we need to find other data points in the meantime. But all of this will be in vain if we don't talk about what we talked about before, the family engagement piece. So including that as well is crucial for our districts to provide services. And I'm gonna, if I may, I know we're running tight on time, but there's, if I can put on my bureaucratic hat on for a while, as I was, in OELA and the, kind of like that federal row, I always like to talk about funding, right? And federal dollars. There's more than Title III funds, right? Everyone talks about Title III Part A, English Language Acquisition Funds. You've got Title I Part A, which is improving basic programs. Title II Part B, supporting effective instruction. As a matter of fact, I'll type some up into chat for all of you. Title IV, which is student support and academic enrichment grants. There's IDEA, right, for students who are English learners and who also have special education needs. Learn grants, which is literacy for all, 21st century and community learning. There's so much available funding within our public school systems that we need to be tapping into to get the resources, to get the professional development, to cover some of these things that I was mentioning. So let's keep that in mind.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Vianna. And yes, feel free to drop any links there. All of us have been dropping a few different links that we feel might be beneficial for those out there. So make sure you take a look at the chat and all the links to resources that are available and out there for you for free. Dr. Forbes, you also have a very unique perspective, and you and Louise are two on the call that I've actually had the honor and privilege to observe your classroom, and I was so impressed with both of your techniques and strategies. Dr. Forbes, your classroom was always so lively, bringing your Chihuahua in. I mean, he made it so much fun, music. I mean, and again, with your background in the arts, I'm just curious if you could share your perspective on how to use the arts and those creative practices, dance, drama, music, to support our newcomer students.
Yeah, for sure. So I remember, Luis, whenever I talked, I guess we both had a background in the arts and in dancing as well. And like I had said, though, it was this idea of being a dancing bilingual veterinarian that I had, and then I had one opportunity to be a permanent substitute for a semester for a Spanish class, and I just fell in love with education. And so whenever I came back, it was so interesting that I was on a cruise ship working as a singer and a dancer, and then I came into a classroom, and within those four walls, I got to learn more about the world and see more of the world than I ever did on that cruise ship. And those students were just the best professors that I ever had. And I'm just always so grateful and so thankful for them. Um, but with that, though, I only knew show business. And so I didn't even know how to make a lesson plan. I was an alternatively certified teacher when I first began. And so all I knew was that the show must go on. And so everything became hands-on, everything became visual, everything, we had scripts, we had plays, we wrote books, we acted things out. But I didn't know at the time. I was like, oh, that's project-based learning. Oh, this is total physical response. Oh, this is helping with listening and speaking and reading all at the same time. And then whenever we write write the script, then now we're writing. And I didn't realize I was bringing all this in. And so it's so exciting, though, to just consider that oftentimes, unfortunately, in education, one of the first things whenever we need to cut programs, they are the arts programs sometimes. And it's those programs that really help on a cognitive level, but also are just so enriching for all of our students to really be able to have this knowledge of learning more about the world around us through the liberal arts. And for example, I love being able to dance with my salsa partner, Marti. She's from Palmira Valle, Colombia. We bailamos nosotros la salsa caleña. We dance salsa caleña together, la cumbia. And so I came from this dance background, and then she's brought me into this whole other world. And so in doing so, by learning the cumbia, for example, she taught me all about like why the steps are how they are, why the movement is how it is, how it connected to slavery at that time. And so whenever they had chains on their ankles, but the wall was right here and they couldn't see it, they thought they were still walking and not dancing because they weren't allowed to be. And so all of this, just what that does for me, it's through the arts that, yes, we get to practice some good listening, speaking, reading, and writing, some metalinguistic awareness. You can use AI, create dialogue. There's so much that you can do with that. But that moment, though, where it takes off into getting to that deeper connection below that surface level. And so what ends up happening is that my interest now becomes a fascination. And with that fascination, I want to learn so much more, and I get to learn more about each other. And I believe that it's really implementing the arts, how this builds so much more empathy in what we're doing. And it makes us get to a point where now we know better about certain things. Now we have to do better and be better. And I feel like the arts was just a great vehicle to allow me to get on a deeper level of understanding cultures, but also really fun and engaging ways to have my students be able to be actively participating in what we were doing together through all their different languages. And we still covered every single standard, and one student still went to Harvard. So things like this in your very first year, when you don't know, you bring in the arts, it can really do great things for students, and it doesn't hurt them in any way, and they can still make it to Harvard. So I always believe in bringing the arts in whenever you can, bringing in the culture, different languages, and just having a great time with it.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Forbes. Laura, I think a couple of times in the session today, project-based learning and competency-based learning has been brought up. It's not always fun to think about assessment, but it is a major portion of supporting our students and gives us necessary feedback. So do you mind discussing just for a couple of minutes, and if you have resources, sending links, how project-based learning and competency-based assessments can be adapted for newcomer students to ensure their success?
Yeah, I mean, we have a core instructional model that we implement across our schools that we call the Hello model, and it has some core principles in it, which I can get into, but I'll just talk about a couple of the ones that are related to that. The two key pieces are the E of the Hello is experiential learning and project-based instruction. And the reason why we do that is to make sure that students are simultaneously learning content and language at the same time. And projects actually allow them, I always call it an accelerated language learning model, because it's really using language and content. It allows them to use their home language as an asset and the experiences they bring, and actually build English language development into the project. And so, because you're actually crossing content and language, and that's our second principle, which is language and content integration. And so both of those, we always say, and I think Dr. Vianna mentioned this, sometimes it's like becomes like too focused on language, right? And we forget that students should be and can handle rigorous content. And so language and content integration should always go hand in hand. Students don't learn language divorced from content, right? There has to be some kind of content where they're using the language in a very authentic way. And so we use competency assessment because you can have really clear language targets, content targets that students are developing simultaneously. And a very strong project is going to have content aligned standards and language standards connected to that project to make sure it's not just a fluff thing that students are doing that might just be like very, surface, but it actually has some anchor standards of content and is pushing them in their language development in multiple modalities. That's really the core work of what happens across all of our classes, and really critical to develop students, social emotionally as well, I would say, because they're also usually working together and collaboratively, but also cognitively, and preparing them. And in fact, most of our schools actually have these rigorous performance assessments that students do after a series, their 4 years of doing projects. They do these large performance assessments that are actually preparing them to move on to college. And I would argue why we have such, our schools, our students are doing so well. And typically our schools are graduating students close to 20% above the district average, and we're taking only the beginning level students in our schools. So yeah.
That's really exciting. Thank you for that insight. And if you have any links, I don't know, maybe you don't, so Hello Model.
Oh yeah, no, actually we just did a learning brief series on our last year's learning brief series. We have 3 learning briefs on project-based instruction and multilingual learners that I will drop in the chat.
Awesome.
And
thank you.
Tells you all about it.
Awesome. So yes, Louise, I know that your work is focused heavily on trauma responsive practices, and I know if this hits home probably more closely than ever right now with what's going on with your family in Lebanon. So just wondering if you just would mind sharing your unique insights on how schools can better support newcomers that have experienced trauma, especially early on in their stages of coming to the United States and integration here. You're on mute.
Good catch. Did you see my toddler make his appearance? Hence the mute. So yes, absolutely. I think, first of all, just in the broader context of trauma impactedness, whether you're multilingual or not, predictability, routine, structure, all of those things create a sense of safety. When students feel safe, we know students are in a better position to learn. So regardless of what your language background is, if students are coming from a historic background of trauma, working really hard to create structures of predictability and routine is really paramount. Trauma brain, survival brain does not like ambiguity. It isn't cool with gray spaces. It likes things black and white. So having as much structure and routine for students to be able to know what's coming next helps minimize some of the unknown. We don't like unknown when we're in survival brain. We want to know what's coming next. We want to know that it's a safe and predictable place. So that's number one. Number two, if we are coming from a background of multilingualism, especially if we're very new to English, reducing some of the language load. I think some of our trauma-informed practices are very well-intended, but can almost be harmful if we're adding another layer of stress, in the sense that we now also have to utilize our whole linguistic repertoire to figure this out and be able to produce and get something out there. So as much as we can do to set down the language load, we're not working on language right now. We're working on self-regulation. And when we talk about self-regulation and regulating our emotional responses, things that, when I say don't require a high vibrational balloon, I'm talking about things like vagus nerve stimulation. So the vagus nerve runs all down our bodies. It regulates all kinds of systems within our body. When we stimulate that vagus nerve, we kick the parasympathetic nervous system into action. And so when I'm talking about that, I'm thinking about putting our head over to our side, looking out at a diagonal. We'll often get a yawn out of this. We might gargle, we might laugh, we might drink water. I do butterfly taps a lot. I do this even before speaking. I just hit here right below the collarbone. I can do it like this too. Students copy me when I do this. That stimulates the vagus nerve. There are lots of things you can do that do not require a high language load. And usually if you start doing some of these, kids will just follow along and do them with you. We can start simply. The most sort of basic ground zero thing we can do is working to get students' names right. And why does this come back to trauma? If we work to explicitly and clearly and be able to say a student's name, our name is as core to our identity. It's the closest thing we have. From a trauma impacted lens, the name is the one thing for most of us, unless we perhaps have a dead name, maybe we've transitioned, there might be other reasons we've left a name behind, but for the vast majority of us, our name is the one thing that stayed with us consistently our entire lives throughout whatever transition, whatever trauma, whatever we've gone through, our name has stayed the same. There's a reason why our name is used as the first grounding piece when we're doing trauma-informed care. We might write our name in bubble letters. We might do the circle of power, in which we start with the name. This is the activity where we then go at the outside circle, record those things that are beyond our control, come back in, identify the things that are in our control, but it starts with the name. So if we begin by not saying names correctly, or skipping over names, or going with the last name, or in whatever way not validating the human's preferred name and pronouns, that's an absolute grounding. So we can start with something as simple as getting names right. And if we're having trouble like explaining that, just there are some sounds that my vocal cords literally cannot produce, but I try and I sound ridiculous, and the student might laugh at me, and I try again and I try again, and but making that effort to make sure we get it right. Similarly, routines. There are so many routines that we overlook in our day-to-day lives, and I say this specifically when we're talking about students who come from backgrounds of limited or interrupted formal education, what we would label as our SLIFE or SLIFE students. For many of us, we learned about basic classroom routines in ECE or kindergarten. If you are new to school, if you've had gaps in school, if you're coming to school in a new country, those very sort of basic routines are now something that creates another level of anxiety. We're coming in, we're settling in. Now we're also looking around and we're trying to see, okay, who's doing what are they doing? How are they putting that where? So looking through, taking a moment to look through your classroom day and pick through some of those things that might seem so ordinary to you. When I say line up at the door, to us, we can sort of visualize what that looks like. But if I'm a high school student from Venezuela and I have been out of school since 2nd grade, and now you tell me to go line up, there's a lot of steps involved in that. I have to stand up, I have to push in my chair, I have to make my way in an orderly way. When I get there, I'm looking front, my hands are at my side, I'm not talking to my neighbor, I don't have my cell phone on. There's a lot of things that are part of that very simple routine. And so we can structure, when I say line up, here's 3 pictures. Here's the chair, here's the little garage you're pushing in that we talk about in early elementary, but this is what it looks like. So when that student then knows what's expected of them, they can do that and build confidence in the seemingly small things instead of looking around and being the last one in line because they don't know the routine. Now they're building confidence in something so simple, in a 1-minute thing, but then that little piece of confidence kicks them into the next piece of the day and the next piece and the next piece.
That's so awesome. Such powerful information from all the panelists. Clearly, I was overly ambitious with our agenda, and many questions that I've wanted to ask, many questions that I'm sure the listeners out there want to ask as well. So wanting to honor everyone's time, we've got like a minute left. But I do think the chat is still available after we're off the call. Sounds like we probably need to do a second session to ask the additional questions. But I am so grateful for all the panelists, Dr. Vianna, Dr. Forbes, Lara, and Louise, for joining us today. Such powerful, meaningful information. I hope all the attendees out there really got a lot out of this session, as I've mentioned in the chat and just earlier. Feel free to email me with any questions that you may have at taylor@eduskills.us. I would be happy to coordinate responses with the panelists